The air was heavy with anticipation. The tourists who had gathered near the solemn memorial expected to see the same ritual they always did, a guard, dressed in flawless uniform, standing immovable before the tomb. Silence was the rule here. Reverence was demanded here. But today, silence trembled under the weight of a storm. He came striding forward like he owned the ground itself, a mountain of muscle, a champion whose fists had broken men in rings around the world. The crowd recognized him instantly. The boxing titan, a name synonymous with dominance, swaggered right up to the line no one was supposed to cross. His grin was wide, careless, daring. To him, this wasn't sacred ground, it was just another. Staged out, the guard did not move. Not a flicker of the eye, not the faintest twitch of the jaw. His rifle rested with precise balance against his shoulder. His boots might as well have been carved into the stone beneath him. To break silence was to betray tradition. To break formation was to betray every fallen soldier whose memory lived here. But the Titan wasn't here for reverence. He leaned closer, circling the guard like a predator sniffing for weakness. "What's the matter, soldier?" he muttered, his words just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "You gonna blink, or are you just a statue in a costume?" A ripple passed through the crowd. Phones came up, cameras clicked, whispers multiplied like sparks in dry grass. Children, curious and frightened, tugged at their parents' sleeves. One little girl buried her face into her father's arm, her tiny voice trembling. "Daddy, will he hurt the soldier?" Still, the guard remained, his breath slow, his body motionless. The Titan chuckled, lifting his massive hands as if preparing for a bout. He shadowboxed mockingly, throwing slow jabs an inch from the guard's face, laughing louder each time his fist sliced through the air. To some onlookers it was entertainment, a show. But to the veterans in the crowd, men and women who knew the cost of sacrifice, it was desecration. Their jaws tightened, their hands curled into fists at their sides. And then, without warning, the Titan stepped in close and shoved the guard's chest with his open palm. The force rippled through the silence like a cannon blast. Gasps erupted, cameras jolted. For one endless second, the world seemed to hold its breath. The guard did not move, not yet. The guard had stood watch for hundreds of hours, through heat and storm, through long nights when fatigue threatened to crush him, and through long days when tourists pressed close with their curious eyes. And yet he had never moved, never faltered. His strength wasn't in muscle, it was in discipline. Discipline that had been forged, not in parades or training drills, but in the fire of war. Years ago, in a foreign desert lit by merciless sun and broken by endless gunfire, he had been a different man. He had been young, full of laughter, carrying photographs of his family in his pack. That all changed on the night when the ambush came. His unit was surrounded. His closest friend, a brother in all but blood, fell beside him with a bullet through his chest. He had pressed his hands against the wound, whispering promises, begging him to hold on. But promises could not keep. A man alive when the world had already chosen otherwise. Since that night, silence had meant something different to him. Silence was not emptiness. Silence was remembrance. Every measured step, every still moment, every second he stood motionless. In uniform was a vow. "I remember you. I will honor you. I will never leave my post. Just as I wish I had never left your side." Pinned beneath his jacket, against his heart, was a single dog tag, not his own, but his fallen friend's. Whenever exhaustion clawed at him, whenever the temptation to shift or falter whispered in his ear, he touched that small piece of cold steel and stood straighter. It was that vow, that oath carved into his bones, that had brought him to this sacred ground. Arlington, the tomb, the memorial, whatever name outsiders gave it. To him it was a promise turned into stone. Here silence reigned because silence was the purest language of respect. Each guard who stood here was not merely guarding marble and grass, but guarding the memory of every soul who had given their final breath in service. The place itself carried a weight you could feel without words. Visitors often spoke in hushed tones, as if afraid that their voices would disturb the invisible spirits who lingered. The cadence of boots on stone, the glint of polished steel, the shifting of rifles, everything was ritual, deliberate, eternal. But not everyone who came here understood that weight. Not everyone respected it. The man now swaggering into the story understood power, yes, but of a different kind. He was called the Boxing Titan not merely for his championship belts, but because of the aura he carried, a mix of brute force and untouchable pride. His fists had leveled opponents in seconds, his scowls had cowed interviewers, and his very name sold out arenas. To him, strength was measured in knockouts, in cheers, in the roar of the crowd chanting his name. Yet with that fame had come arrogance. Reporters whispered about bar fights where he had gone too far. Fans remembered the press conferences where he mocked opponents not just with words, but with shoves and cheap blows. Every insult rolled off him, every scandal fed his legend. In his mind, the world adored him not despite his defiance, but because of it. So when a politician, eager for headlines and controversy, dared him to test the limits of the Guard, he didn't hesitate. Why would he? To him, the Guard was nothing but a soldier in costume, a mannequin with a rifle, a statue playing soldier for the tourists. What was discipline compared to power? What was stillness compared to fists that could flatten a man twice over? To the Titan, this was an opportunity, another stage, another chance to prove he was untouchable. He pictured the headlines already. Champion faces down soldier. He saw himself grinning on the front pages, standing victorious in front of a man who wasn't even allowed to move. The crowd would laugh. The cameras would roll. His legend would grow. But what he failed to understand was that this ground was not his arena. This was not a boxing ring where the cheers decided the outcome. This was hallowed ground, where silence weighed more than applause, and where the man standing before him had already faced death itself, and had not broken. The contrast could not have been sharper. One man chasing glory, fueled by ego and spectacle. The other bound by vow, fueled by memory and loss. One man seeking to win, the other committed only to stand. And as the tourists gathered closer, sensing that something unusual was about to unfold, those differences became the invisible currents shaping the moment. Veterans in the crowd straightened, their eyes narrowing as they recognized the kind of man the Guard was. Parents hushed their children, unsure whether to shield their eyes or let them witness history. Reporters adjusted their lenses, greedy for whatever image would come next. Even the air seemed to tighten, heavy with expectation. The stone pillars stood tall, watching. The engraved names of the fallen whispered without voices. Do not falter, do not bend. The Guard felt the weight of those whispers. He touched the cold steel dog tag hidden beneath his jacket and drew strength. His posture remained unshaken, his eyes fixed forward, steady as iron, and into that sacred silence, the Titan strode with a grin, fists itching for mischief. He believed this would be just another performance. He believed his fame and his fists could bend even tradition itself. But tradition, as he was about to learn, does not bend. The first shove was only the beginning. The boxing Titan's hand lingered on the Guard's chest for a heartbeat, as if daring the man to move. When no response came, he laughed, a deep, mocking sound that cut through the sacred silence. The sound itself felt like blasphemy in that place, like laughter in the middle of a funeral. He turned toward the crowd, arms spread wide. You see, he called out, voice booming with theatrical triumph. Not even a flinch, not even a blink. This is your great warrior, just a toy soldier in uniform. A few in the crowd laughed nervously. Some of his fans, recognizing their idol's bravado, even cheered. Go on, champ, one voice called. Show him who's boss. Another whistled, as though this were nothing more than a sideshow act. But others stood stiff, their faces dark with outrage. A veteran in the front row clenched his jaw so tightly his lips trembled. Beside him, an older woman, clutching a bouquet of flowers for a son buried nearby, whispered, how dare he? The Guard, however, remained unchanged. Rifle steady, boots locked, gaze fixed. He had been trained for this. More than trained, he had lived through worse. Shoves, jeers, even violence were nothing compared to the battlefield, compared to the sound of a brother's last breath. The Titan didn't understand that. To him, silence looked like weakness. Stillness looked like surrender. So he pushed further. He began circling the Guard, bouncing lightly on the balls of his feet, the way he did in the ring. His fists danced in the air, weaving slow jabs inches from the Guard's face. Come on, he taunted. One punch, just one. Show them you're not made of stone. Gasps rippled through the audience each time his fist came close. Children pressed tighter against their parents, eyes wide with fear. One boy muttered, is he gonna hit him? A father shook his head, whispering, he can't, he's not allowed. But the boy's eyes didn't leave the Guard's face. The stillness unsettled him even more than the Titan's movements. It was as if the man had fused with the marble, becoming part of the memorial itself, something immovable, untouchable. The Titan, sensing the tension, only grew bolder. He stepped forward suddenly, his shoulder slamming into the Guard's. The impact echoed faintly across the stone walkway. Still, no movement, no reaction. The crowd's energy shifted. What had begun as nervous laughter was dissolving into unease. Even the fans who had cheered grew quieter, their voices trailing off. The spectacle was taking a darker turn. The Titan smirked, licking his lips, fueled by his own ego. He leaned in close, his voice a low growl meant only for the guard to hear, though the crowd leaned forward, straining for every syllable. "You're nothing without that gun. Nothing but a man in a suit, hiding behind rules." Silence, the lack of response, infuriated him. He wanted a reaction, he needed one. What good was a performance if the other man refused to play along? His fists itched, and the restless energy of a fighter who had always been answered with cheers surged through him, so he raised his voice again, projecting for all to hear. "Look at this." He gestured dramatically at the guard. "A statue, a mannequin, and you worship him." He glanced at the veterans glaring from the sidelines and smirked. Pathetic. The veterans' faces hardened. One man in a wheelchair muttered through clenched teeth, "He has no idea what that soldier stands for." The silence of the guard was no longer just discipline, it had become defiance. Every unmoving second screamed louder than words. The boxer's arrogance clashed against an unspoken wall of honor, and the longer it lasted, the more the crowd began to feel the weight of it. Reporters' cameras clicked furiously. One whispered to another, "This is history. Whatever happens next, the world's going to see it." The Titan wasn't finished. He ripped the sunglasses off his face and tossed them to the ground with a dramatic flourish. He puffed his chest, squared up, and began to shadow box faster, closer. His fists brushed the edge of the guard's cap. His breath nearly touched the guard's cheek, and then, mockingly, he snapped his boots together, raised his hand in a sloppy imitation of a salute, and barked, "Sir, yes, sir," before bursting into raucous laughter. A few fans chuckled, weakly, but most of the crowd stood frozen in disapproval. The air grew heavy, charged with a strange electricity. Even the children seemed to sense that something sacred was being violated. A little girl whispered, "Why doesn't he fight back?" Her mother eyes misted whispered, "Because he's stronger than that." The Titan paused, scanning the crowd, and his smirk faltered just slightly. For the first time, he noticed the eyes on him weren't filled with admiration but judgment. He wasn't the hero here. He was the intruder. That realization only stoked his anger. He turned back to the guard, eyes narrowing. "You think you're better than me," he hissed. "Let's see what happens when I make you move." He feinted. Another jab, faster this time, the air cracking inches from the guard's face. The sound drew gasps and cries from the crowd. One veteran shouted, "Enough." But the Titan only grinned wider. He shoved again, harder, his palm slamming into the guard's shoulder. The rifle rattled slightly but did not fall. The guard's posture never broke. The silence became unbearable. It wasn't weakness, it was power. The kind of power the Titan had never known, because it didn't come from fists or fury. It came from something deeper, something eternal, and the crowd felt it too. The veterans stood straighter, their anger tempered by pride. The parents held their children close, whispering explanations they hoped the little ones would carry forever. Even the reporters, usually predators for scandal, seemed almost reverent as their shutters clicked. Still the guard did not move. Still the Titan prowled, desperate, restless, furious. And then, at last, his ego reached the breaking point. He stepped closer than ever, his voice rising into a roar. "You will look at me, you will move." His hand shot out, striking at the guard's cap, the sacred symbol of his uniform, knocking it askew with a flick. The crowd erupted in a chorus of gasps, some even crying out as though a crime had been committed before their eyes. Phones shook as they captured every second. The Titan sneered, lowering his fists. "What now, statue? What are you going to do?" The guard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The silence deepened until even the birds seemed to stop their song. Everyone knew something was about to break. The cap slid from the guard's head and landed against the stone walkway with a hollow clack. For a moment, time itself seemed to stop. The crowd's gasps hung in the air. Phones quivered in hands. Veterans froze in disbelief, their jaws tight. With fury, even the children understood something sacred had just been broken. The Titan smirked, his broad chest rising and falling with pride. He looked to the audience as though expecting applause. "There it is," he crowed. "I moved. Him what now?" But when he turned back, he saw it, not rage, not fear, not even irritation. The guard's face was a mask of discipline, forged from years of silence and vows older than the Titan's career. The hat may have fallen, but the man beneath it had not. The guard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a motion so small most would have missed it. But the veterans in the crowd recognized it instantly. That was no weakness. That was the line, the silent oath, hardening into steel. The Titan leaned closer, grinning. You think you're stronger than me, don't you? Let's see about that. His voice dropped into a growl. Let's see if honor can take a punch. And with that, his massive fist rose. The crowd gasped, several voices shouting, no. A mother shielded her child's eyes, while a veteran in a wheelchair slammed his fist on the armrest and roared, enough. But the Titan's arm was already swinging, muscle coiled, power unleashed. The punch struck. The sound was sharp, brutal, flesh meeting bone with a crack that echoed across the memorial. The guard's head snapped slightly to the side under the force of the blow. Gasps and cries tore through the crowd, cameras jolting in frantic hands. For one endless moment, it seemed impossible that anyone could withstand such power. The boxing titan had dropped giants with less, and yet, the guard did not fall. He did not stagger. He did not even raise his hands in retaliation. He simply stood. The titan blinked, confusion flashing across his face. He had expected collapse, blood, maybe even unconsciousness. But the guard stood motionless, boots rooted in the stone as though fused to it. His rifle never dipped, never faltered. His silence thundered louder than the punch. A hush swept over the crowd. Even the reporters lowered their cameras for half a second, stunned into stillness. The guard's breathing slowed, controlled. Beneath his jacket, his fingers brushed the cold steel of the dog tag against his chest, the reminder of the friend he had lost, the oath he had sworn. He had survived war. He had survived grief. He would not be broken here, not by fists, not by arrogance. The titan snarled, stepping forward for another strike. But this time, the guard moved, not in anger, not in retaliation, but with the precision of training honed to perfection. As the titan's arm came forward, the guard shifted a subtle sidestep, crisp and measured. His free hand rose, not to strike but to deflect. The motion was minimal, controlled, exactly enough to redirect the force of the punch. The titan's momentum carried him forward, off balance, and then, in one fluid motion, the guard's arm locked around the titan's wrist. His rifle never left its place at his shoulder. He did not break formation. He did not lash out. He simply restrained, his stance solid as granite. The titan struggled, twisting, but the guard's grip was iron. There was no violence in it, only control. The crowd could see it. The guard was not fighting. He was containing. He was showing the world the difference between chaos and discipline. The silence deepened, broken only by the titan's grunts as he tried to pull free, his face twisted with frustration. He was a man used to overpowering opponents, but here, against an immovable will, his strength meant nothing. The guard released him with the same precision he had restrained him. A step back, rifle steady, posture reset. He had made his point. Without a word, without a punch of his own, the crowd erupted, not in cheers, but in a collective gasp of awe. Veterans saluted instinctively. Parents whispered to their children, "Remember this. Remember what you saw today." The titan staggered back, face flushed with humiliation. He shouted, "Fight me, come on, hit me back." His voice cracked, desperate, almost pleading. But the guard remained silent. It was the silence that destroyed him. The crowd understood now. The real power wasn't in fists. It was in self-control. It was in refusing to be dragged down into chaos. It was in standing for something greater than oneself. Reporters captured every second, their cameras flashing like lightning. The moment was immortalized, destined for headlines around the world. Discipline versus chaos. The soldier who stood still. The titan tried once more, shoving hard against the guard's chest, but the guard didn't budge. He simply adjusted his stance, eyes forward, unshaken. The contrast was unbearable. One man unraveling in desperation, the other unbreakable. In silence, the veterans in the crowd began clapping slowly, firmly. The sound spread, hesitant at first, then stronger. Not applause for spectacle, but for reverence. For the man who had just demonstrated that true strength was not in fists, but in the refusal to betray his oath. The titan looked around, chest heaving, and realized the truth. The crowd was no longer with him. They weren't laughing, they weren't cheering, they weren't on his side. They were with the guard, and in that moment, his legend cracked. The boxing titan's roar echoed against the memorial stones, but it no longer carried the weight of triumph. It sounded desperate now, hollow, the cry of a man realizing the crowd that once adored him was slipping from his grasp. He lunged, again, but before his fists could find their mark, security stormed in. Uniformed officers and memorial staff rushed across the stone path, placing themselves between the titan and the guard. The scene erupted with motion, arms outstretched, voices raised, a scramble of authority pressing against arrogance. The Titan thrashed, shouting, "Get off me. He's nothing. I'll prove it. I'll prove it." His fists swung wildly, not at the guard anymore, but at the hands restraining him. The once celebrated champion now looked less like a hero and more like a cornered animal. The guard did not move. He didn't flinch, didn't adjust, didn't even acknowledge the chaos unfolding only feet away. His boots stayed rooted, his rifle steady. His face remained carved from stone, unbothered, untouched. That was the moment the contrast became undeniable. The Titan, flailing, red-faced, trapped in his own fury. The guard, still silent, untouchable. The crowd knew instantly who had won. Phones recorded everything, the rapid clicking of shutters blending with the shouts of security. The footage would be replayed millions of times, dissected frame by frame. The punch that landed, the restraint that followed, the silence that spoke louder than violence. Step back. An officer barked, dragging the Titan by the arm. His resistance weakened under the collective weight of uniformed men pressing in. Reporters swarmed at the edges, their cameras flashing. Like lightning in a storm, the Titan spat curses, still trying to save face. He's a coward, just standing there hiding behind rules. But his words rang hollow. No one believed him. No one cheered. His legend, built on fists and bravado, was unraveling before the eyes of the world. And then, as the last officer shoved the disgraced champion aside, the guard did something so small, so simple. It turned the entire scene into legend. Bent down, picked up his fallen cap with measured precision, brushed the dust from its brim, and set it back on his head. The gesture was as deliberate as a ritual, as sacred as a prayer. Then, without hesitation, he resumed his stance, rifle steady, eyes forward, boots planted exactly where tradition demanded. The crowd fell silent again, but this silence was different. It wasn't the tense quiet of anticipation, it was reverence. Awe. Parents whispered to their children, "Watch him. This is what strength looks like." Veterans saluted, tears glistening in their eyes. Even the reporters, often vultures for scandal, lowered their cameras for a moment, humbled by what they were witnessing. The Titan, panting in restraints, could only stare. He had thrown his hardest punch. He had mocked, shoved, and jeered, and yet the man he tried to break now stood taller than ever, untouched by the storm. The guard had not needed to fight back. He had not needed to raise his voice or his fists. His victory lay in stillness, in refusing to be dragged into the chaos, in showing the world that tradition, discipline, and silence were stronger than brute force. And the world noticed that within minutes. Clips began to surge across the internet. Headlines were already forming in reporters' minds. Titan's punch meets unbreakable discipline. The soldier who stood still, when silence defeated fury. The moment wasn't just captured, it was immortalized as security. Escorted the Titan away, his curses fading into the distance. The guard remained at his post, as though nothing had happened. The sacred ground was quiet again. The ritual restored. Chaos had come. Discipline had endured. And in that stark, unforgettable contrast, a viral legend was born. The chaos faded slowly, like the echoes of thunder rolling away after a storm. Security escorted the boxing Titan down the long path, his voice growing smaller with each step until only silence remained. The crowd watched him vanish, but no one followed with jeers or cheers. He was gone, and in his place was something far more powerful, the enduring stillness of the guard. He stood exactly where he had been before the intrusion, boots planted on the stone, rifle steady at his shoulder. To an unknowing passerby, it might have seemed as though nothing at all had happened. But for those who had witnessed it, everything had changed. The silence that now blanketed the memorial was not heavy with tension as before. It was sacred, reverent. Each heartbeat in the crowd seemed to slow, each breath taken with quiet care. People stood straighter, eyes fixed on the soldier who had just demonstrated a lesson they would never forget. An older veteran was the first to act. He raised his trembling hand in salute, his eyes glassy with memory. The gesture was contagious. Others followed, men in uniform caps, women clutching folded flags, fathers and mothers who had come to honor their own fallen. Soon, a line of salutes rippled through the crowd like a wave. The guard did not acknowledge it. That was not his role. He kept his eyes forward, unwavering, but somewhere beneath the unbreakable surface, he felt it, the weight of their respect, the unity of strangers who, for a brief moment, remembered together. From behind the crowd, footsteps approached, the sharp, steady rhythm of military boots striking stone. A figure emerged, a colonel, silver-haired uniform, immaculate, his chest decorated with ribbons that spoke of decades of service. He walked with purpose, cutting through the gathered civilians until he stood a few paces from the guard. The colonel stopped. For a moment, he simply studied the young man before him, the posture perfect, the face resolute. Then, slowly, he lifted his own hand in a crisp salute. It was not a salute of rank or regulation. It was one soldier honoring another. The crowd, already hushed, grew even quieter, as if the world itself leaned in to witness. Still, the guard did not move. He could not. His duty was to remain, to embody the tradition. But in his chest, the weight of that salute settled like a medal more valuable than any pinned by ceremony. Among the onlookers, the little girl who had clutched her father's arm earlier peered out once more. Her eyes were wide, no longer afraid, but shining with wonder. She tugged at her father's sleeve and whispered, just loud enough for those near to hear, "Daddy, he's a real hero." The words were soft, but they carried. Heads turned, smiles broke through the solemnity, tears welled in eyes. The phrase echoed in the silence, a child's truth piercing more deeply than any headline or camera flash ever could. The father knelt, brushing a hand through her hair, and replied, "Yes, sweetheart, he is." The moment settled into hearts like an imprint that would not fade. When the crowd finally began to drift away, speaking in hushed tones, the guard remained at his post. He would stay until relieved, as was the tradition, yet beneath the surface of his stillness, memories stirred. He felt the weight of the dog tag pressing faintly against his chest. His fingers itched to touch it, to ground himself in its cold steel. When his shift ended and another guard came to take his place, he finally allowed himself the smallest movement. He reached into his jacket and drew out the worn piece of metal. The name etched into it caught the last light of the day. His friend's name, his brother's, the one he had sworn to never forget. For a long moment, he stared at it. Around him, the memorial was quiet again, restored to its sacred calm. The chaos had passed, leaving only memory, memory of sacrifice, memory of honor, memory of a lesson taught without a word spoken. He thought of the punch he had taken, the restraint he had shown. He thought of the colonel's salute, of the little girl's whisper. He thought of the headlines already spinning beyond these walls. But none of that mattered as much as the promise he had kept to the name in his hand. "I stood my ground," he murmured under his breath, voice barely audible, meant only for the fallen. "For you, always for you." The words vanished into the air, carried off like a prayer. He tucked the tag back beneath his jacket and straightened his shoulders. Once more, no medal would be pinned on him for this. No speech would be delivered in his honor. But he did not need those things. His reward was something greater, the knowledge that, when tested, he had remained faithful. He had stood as he promised he would, and as the evening light stretched long across the stones, the guard resumed his silent watch, eternal as the ground he swore to protect. There are moments in history that do not need grand speeches or gilded medals to make them unforgettable. Sometimes all it takes is a single act of quiet defiance, a man standing his ground when the world expects him to fall. What happened that day at the memorial was not just an incident. It was not just a clash between a reckless athlete and a soldier bound by tradition. It was something deeper, something that reached into the marrow of every person who watched, because what the world saw was not weakness. It was strength of the rarest kind. The guard did not lift a hand in retaliation. He did not step down, did not bend to the weight of chaos, anger, or disrespect. He absorbed it. He stood as the generations before him had stood still, resolute, immovable. In that silence, in that unyielding posture, he spoke louder than any shouted threat or thrown punch ever could. And that is why the crowd gasped. That is why veterans raised their salutes and children whispered words they will never forget. Not because a man in uniform fought back, but because he didn't have to. Tradition is not fragility. Stillness is not passivity. These things are often misunderstood in a world that glorifies noise, speed, and spectacle. But the guard revealed their true meaning. He reminded us that strength is not always found in the fist, or in the roar of a crowd, but in the discipline to hold steady when every instinct screams to move. The boxing titan entered that sacred place believing his size, his fists, his fame could bend discipline, but he left in handcuffs, exposed not by violence, but by his own emptiness. His chaos met a wall of silence, and silence won. That lesson is not bound to the marble of Arlington or the stones of any monument. It belongs to all of us, every day. Each of us faces moments of provocation, small or great, an insult, a shove, a test of patience when our pride feels at risk. In those moments, we have a choice. We can lash out, proving nothing but our own weakness, or we can stand still, anchored by principle, showing that strength does not need to shout. This is why the Guard story spread far beyond those walls. Phones recorded it, clips went viral, headlines flashed across the world. But beneath the clicks and shares, there was something quieter happening. People reflected on what they had seen. Soldiers wrote of it. Teachers spoke of it in classrooms. Parents told their children, that is what it means to stand with honor. And perhaps most importantly, a promise was renewed. A promise that sacrifice, discipline, and tradition will not be drowned out by arrogance or noise. That there will always be men and women who take their posts, who stand in silence, who protect not just with weapons but with unbreakable resolve. So, as we close this story, let us carry its weight. Let us remember that stillness is not surrender, it is strength. That discipline is not coldness, it is devotion. And that honor is not an old word from history books, but a living principle we can embody in how we speak, how we act, and how we choose to stand when tested. Because one day each of us will face our own moment, not with cameras rolling, not with crowds watching, but in the quiet space of our lives where the easy path is to react, and the harder path is to stand firm. And in that moment, the memory of this guard can guide us. He taught us without words that true strength is not in the strike, but in the silence after. And so I leave you with this. Tradition is not weakness. Stillness is strength. Honor is eternal. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded of that truth. Let it travel further than the cameras could reach. And if you wish to see more stories like this, stories of discipline, sacrifice, and the quiet power of those who serve, subscribe, stay with us, and help us honor the legacy of those who never waver, because as long as we remember them, they never truly stand alone.